Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Pippa. I work for Five Leaves Bookshop. I will actually be disappearing from your screens in a moment, but first I'd like to welcome you to the fourth of our flying visits to UNESCO Cities of Literature around the world. We're particularly pleased to be joined by Lviv UNESCO City of Literature today. Given the current situation in Ukraine, we want to extend as much support and friendship and literary goodness to them as possible. Couple of bits of housekeeping. Please use the Q&A at any time for questions for either or both authors, and do feel free to use the chat to comment or applaud as the event proceeds. So now I will disappear and I'll hand over to our hosts, Stefan and Irina.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening, and welcome to Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature from UNESCO City of Literature. Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature has created a vibrant programme of projects and events which celebrate the city's literary heritage and its contemporary scene. These include Big City Reads, a campaign this summer in which over 2,000 books were given away. Young Voices Amplified, which is a poetry programme which engages young people across the city. Slamavision, a slam poetry competition held between UNESCO Cities of Literature. Last year's contest was won by Cora Thompson's poem Island Screams, which means that Nottingham is the reigning Slamavision champion. The people behind Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature inspire Nottingham to read, write, and build a better future with words. The next city on Five Leaves itinerary is Jakarta UNESCO City of Literature, and join Five Leaves on November the 1st when Nicola Monaghan meets Ziggy Zabriskie, and there'll be details of that posted in the link in the chat. And now I have pleasure in handing over to Bogdana, who will tell you a little about Lviv UNESCO City of Literature. Bogdana.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, guys. First of all, I want to thank you to everyone who is here today. Thanks to Irina, thanks to Oksana that they agreed to join us on this event. And thank you for Five Books for hosting us and proposing this project. As Nottingham, we are also the City of Literature from 2015. And our office is pretty small. It's about 4 people. Which are now working as an office which is trying to network the local literature community. It was such a situation for the last 4 years, but from the beginning of the war, we started to think more about the promoting of Ukrainian literature and Lviv writers across the world, and that's why it's very important for us to have projects like this to showcase our literature and so it could give more understanding about our culture and what is happening now in Ukraine. We are now also running the program for the young writers. It's a joint project this year with the Vilnius City of Literature, and today we will be talking about Lithuanian literature also, or culture also here. And we are now, this program is for the young emerging writers who are now writing about the situation in Ukraine and in Lithuania, about how war is impacting their lives. And they will be translated from Ukrainian into Lithuanian and from Lithuanian into Ukrainian. And also Melbourne City of Literature decided to join this project, and we will do the translation into English. So in the end, probably everyone here could read these young writers from Ukraine. Also, I hope we will be having our Literature Prize this year, still hoping. We are now fighting for it. And I need to say that Irina was the first head of our jury for the Literature Prize in Lviv, and Oksana is one of our laureates of the Lviv UNESCO City of Literature Prize. So I am very delighted to have them here today, and I hope that you will, from their perspective, from their works and their literature works, you will understand better and feel the Ukrainian love for literature world, and what is so special about our literature in the core of it. Thank you, guys. So probably that's all.
Yes. Good evening to everybody. It's a special pleasure for me today to be a co-host of this meetup between John and Oksana. And let me introduce that Oksana Lutsyshyna is a Ukrainian writer, poet, literary scholar, and translator. In the early 2000s, she left for the United States to study for the MA and then to defend her PhD there. Currently, she teaches the Ukrainian language and Eastern European literature at the University of Texas in Austin. She has published 4 poetry collections in Ukrainian and in Ukraine, 1 collection of short stories, and she got particular accolade for her 2 recent novels. Her most recent novel, Ivan and Phoebe, won the Lviv City of Literature UNESCO Prize in 2020 and the Taras Shevchenko National Prize for Fiction in 2021. An English translation will be published this year or early next year, and we all are waiting for this translation. Oksana thinks of herself as being a feminist writer in a culture which is on the move, which is in dynamics, departing from more traditional and patriarchal society. This is society which produced 2 revolutions and a big war within the last decade. So actually, Oksana's prose is in tune with the social and cultural developments, social and cultural encounters, and the energy of the country itself. For me, it's also a kind of enigma because these 22 years Oksana lives mainly in the US, but knows everything and keep her hand on the pulse of our Ukrainian developments. So please, Oksana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Irina. It's a great pleasure to see you and to see everybody. And thank you so much to the UNESCO City of Literature Foundations and to the Five Leaves Bookshop and to our host and to everybody present. I'm very honored to have had the prize from the UNESCO Lviv City of Literature. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Yes, I'm going to read an excerpt from Ivan and Phoebe, which is the novel that Irina mentioned. And it's actually about Transcarpathia, which is an area of Ukraine that usually doesn't get too much attention. It's the region on the border with Hungary and Slovakia. So there's some coloring of that kind there. And the excerpt describes preparations for a wedding, kind of more or less traditional one, though it's happening in the city. On Friday morning, pandemonium descended. There were people everywhere. Ivan could not turn without bumping into workmen in freshly stained overalls or women from his own and Phoebe's families who were moving pillows, bedding, or china. Both floors of the house, even the half-finished second one, were abuzz. Katerina Ivanivna, Phoebe's mother, cleaned the second floor bedroom while workmen laid tile in the not yet functional kitchen. The tile and the workmen had been ordered by Miron Vasilyevich, Phoebe's father, and he was paying for both. But that did not mean Margita, Ivan's mother, wasn't pulling her hair. She would have fixed the renovations at a much better price, albeit a slower pace, but why wouldn't you just go a little slower for the sake of a good deal? And Deuce's godfather would have done everything just fine and would have charged not a lot. Among all the ruckus and Margita's scratching, Phoebe was ordered to sit in the kitchen table with a large bowl of warm, soapy water and wash the stemware. Phoebe sat there with her head down and her long wavy hair clogged her delicate shoulders. Goblets and glasses made small squeaky sounds under her fingers as she rubbed the golden rims and the tender crystal stems. Margita, indefatigable, dashed to and fro, and her sisters, Ivan's aunts, Ildia and Ondia, flew at her heels. They polished surfaces, scrubbed floors, baked the sweet shutameni Hungarian pastries, and moved mountains with their bare hands like 3 giantesses, primal mothers of the world, born themselves for superhuman tasks. There was nothing they did not know, could not, or would not do. They were of 100 eyes and 100 hands. They made the bed for Ivan and Phoebe, polished the just laid tile in their new kitchen on the second floor, cut roses in the garden and made them into bouquets for the living room and the bedroom, and bottled tart homemade wine. They came into the kitchen carrying lengths of linen and scissors and cut through the thick fabric, making shapes. They asked Phoebe to hold one end. Ildia creased her angular, wrinkled face into smiles and talked to Margita, not yet quite as old, but already touched by time. Ondia, the eldest, called to them to the stove. That's where she was, starting to bake and cook. She couldn't leave all of that thieving hired hands. Ondia was thinner than her sisters, but had the same mouth, and called out in Hungarian over the crackling of the lard in her pans and the ruckus overhead. She arrived the day before from Hungary, where she'd lived for many years, and from where she brought her sisters magazines with pretty homes and gardens, smoked chicken thighs, spices, the Erosh Pishta chili sauce, vegeta seasoning, and jeans.
Thanks for that, Oksana. That's beautiful, beautiful. But the rush of prep for a wedding there, and just it struck me then and remind about what a big country Ukraine is, and the variety of different national influences you have in the country. Thanks very much for that reading. Now I'm going to introduce John, who I'm sure needs no introduction to most of us. John, of course, is the preeminent Nottingham novelist, but also one of the preeminent English novelists at this moment in time. John's first novel, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, was on the long list for the 2002 Man Booker Prize and went on to win several other awards. His second novel, So Many Ways to Begin, was also on the Booker long list, as was Reservoir 13, which won the Costa Book Award for the best novel. He was awarded the International Dublin Literary Award in 2012 for his novel Even the Dogs, and he's been professor of creative writing at Nottingham University since 2012. A beautiful novelist, a great stylist. Welcome, John. Nice to have you here this evening.
Very nice to be here. And as everyone else has already said, thank you to Five Leaves for hosting, and thank you to the Cities of Literature of Nottingham and Lviv for bringing us together. It's a really exciting opportunity to connect like this. Would you like me to read something? Okay. I am going to read from the novel before my last one, Reservoir 13, which you were just good enough to mention. And this is from the beginning of the novel, so it needs no introduction. At midnight, when the year turned, there were fireworks going up from the towns beyond the valley, but they were too far off for the sound to carry, and no one came out to watch. The dance at the village hall was cancelled, and although the Gladstone was full, there was no mood for celebration. Tony closed the bar at 1:30 the hour, and everyone made their way home. Only the police stayed out in the streets, gathered around their vans or heading back into the hills. In the morning, the rain started up once again. Water coursed from the swollen peat beds quickly through the cloughs and down the stepped paths which fell from the edge of the moor. The river thickened with silt from the hills and plumed across the weirs. On the moor, there were flags marking where the parents said they'd walked. The flags furled and snapped in the wind. At the visitor centre, television trucks filled the car park and journalists started to gather. In the village hall, the trestle tables were laid with green cups and saucers, the urns rising to the boil and the smell of bacon cobs drifting out into the rain. At the Hunter place, there were voices coming from the barn conversion where the parents were staying, loud enough that the policeman outside could hear. A helicopter flew in from the reservoirs, banking slowly along the river and passing over the weir and the quarry and the woods. The divers were going through the river again. A group of journalists waited for the shot, standing behind a cordon by the Packhorse Bridge, cameras aimed at the empty stretch of water, the breath clouding over their heads. In the lower field, two of Jackson's boys were kneeling beside a fallen ewe. There was a racket of camera shutters as the first diver appeared, the wet-suited head sleek and slow through the water. A second diver came round the bend, and a third. They took turns ducking through the arch in the bridge, and then they were out of sight. The camera crews jerked their cameras from the tripods and began folding everything away. One of the Jackson boys bucked a quad bike across the field and told the journalists to move. The river ran empty and quick. The cement works were shut down to allow for a search. In a week, the first snowdrops emerged along the verges past the cricket ground, while it seemed winter yet had a way to go. At the school in the staff room, the teachers kept their coats on and waited. Everything that might be said seemed like the wrong thing to say. Mrs. Simpson came in and thanked them for the early start. They all said, of course, it wasn't a problem, under the circumstances. Mrs. Simpson said the plan was to follow their lessons as normal, but be ready to talk about the situation if the children asked, which it seemed likely they would. When the children were brought to school, Mrs. Simpson stood at the gate to welcome them. The parents lingered once the children had gone inside, watching the doors being locked. Some of them looked as though they could stand there all day. It snowed, and the snow settled thickly. There was a service at the church. The vicar asked the police to keep the media away. Anyone was welcome to attend, she said, but she wanted no photography or recording, no waving of notebooks. She wanted no spectacle made of a community caught in the agony of prayer. The wardens put out extra chairs, but people were still left standing along the aisles. The men who weren't used to being in church stood with their hats bent into their hands, leaning against the ends of the pews. Some folded their arms expectantly. The regulars offered them service books open to the correct page. The vicar, Jane Hughes, said she hoped no one had come looking for answers. She said she hoped no one was asking for comfort. There is no comfort in the situation we find ourselves in today, she said. There is no comfort for the girls' parents or for the family members who have travelled to the village to support them. No comfort for the police officers who have been involved in the search. We can only trust that we might meet God among us in these times of trouble, only ask that we not allow ourselves to be overcome by a grief which is not ours to indulge, but instead be uplifted by faith and enabled to help that suffering family in whatever way we are called to do. She paused and closed her eyes. She held out her hands in a gesture she hoped might resemble prayer. The men who had their arms folded kept them folded. The warden rang the bell 3 times, and the sound carried out through the brightening morning along the valley as far as the old quarry. At the end of the month, the sun came out and the fields softened. The still air shook to the thump of melting rooftop snow. There were rumours, and only rumours, of where the parents might be now. They were beside themselves, it was said. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Wow, that's quite a reading as well. Moving here from marriage to death and potentially all the cycles of life, which we as novelists as grapple with. Well, it's lovely to be here this evening to talk to these writers, and I would welcome any of our guests and audience to pop some questions into the question box, and we can feed those in during our conversation here this evening. I don't know if you mind me just kicking off a little bit of conversation, and Irena, I'll ask you to come in as well, but it just struck me there, listening to both of you, how rooted your writing was in your particular nationality. And I was wondering how important that is to you, your sense of nationality in terms of your writing. I don't know who wants to kick that one off. Oksana, do you want to have a kick off on that one? How important is your Ukrainianness in terms of your fiction?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that myself quite often. And it seems like on the one hand, I am kind of like that Greek mythology hero, Anceus, who whenever he touches his native land, that is his mother, he feels stronger. I mean, it sounds kind of trite, but it's true. And I definitely, whenever I come to Ukraine, each time it's a new experience, and each time it's an experience that you immediately recognize. It's some kind of truth waking up inside you. Well, having said that, I have to say that I do have things that are set somewhere else and that are not necessarily related to Ukraine as space. But then you're right, it's more like an identity thing that wakes up, and it's never just some American person walking around. It's always going to be a person from Eastern Europe. So I guess Eastern Europe is pretty much what I am at this point.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Stefan. I think I have never thought of myself as writing about Englishness or Britishness, and I have a very, very complicated relationship with my my national identity, and it's not always an identity or a place to be particularly proud of or comfortable with. But I think I am interested. I've always been interested in trying to write things as I see them rather than how they're sometimes represented. And I think there's often misrepresentation of, for example, village life in the heart of England. And so with that book, I was interested in kind of the details of what the place is really like and what people really do and how they really relate to each other. So I guess I'm interested in accuracy and overcoming misrepresentation, and I'm writing about where I know, and that happens to be England, where I live.
Yes, I'm sure the big stories happen everywhere and not necessarily in big places like in huge cities or cosmopolitan capitals. And yes, it struck me when you have been reading one after another that there is this, let's say, provincial setting. There is a very slow flow of the time. And there are also two generations because parents are present in one and another piece. And the standpoint is from the, let's say, a bit younger generation. Does that make sense for you? Do you think that you want to somehow contemplate on that?
You mean this kind of interactions between people of different generations and how they perceive their place in everything? Yeah, I think so. I think there's definitely a lot of stereotypes attached to that. And while John was speaking, it struck me that I guess for John, the task would be harder because there's so much written about the English countryside and all this Agatha Christie and everything that a foreigner will have to plow through. But in Ukraine, it would be probably a little bit of the opposite. There would be so little written. Even if we do have our classics, it's not like we ourselves have necessarily read them. I know that people from other parts of Ukraine were largely unfamiliar with Transcaucasian tradition. So it was kind of, they didn't really know what that older generation was like. And actually, Transcaucasia became part of the Soviet Union only in 1946, which means that before that, well, it was Austro-Hungary and Czechoslovakia, then it was under Hitler. And so basically, when Soviet Union came, and when I was born, for example, we had this generation that had living memory of something else, which was not the case for the rest of Ukraine. So I guess it was would be harder for the rest of Ukraine to even relate to what these people were like. So I would say, yes, generations definitely the generational divide plays a great role in my case.
Yeah, I think in that novel in particular, I was really interested in generations, the way different generations see themselves. And I think rural life in England is going through particularly big changes at the moment with just, the economics and the traditions. And whereas the older generations have lots of experience of, the children doing the same jobs that their parents did and kind of continuing in the same traditions, for the current young generation, those options are often not available. And so there's a real kind of tension and a mismatch around expectations. And that was one of the things I was really interested in exploring. And also just the way different generations see the world and talk about the world and relate to each other.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What was interesting as well is that you both write in that sense in a fairly kind of domestic setting, in terms of the fact that we're not dealing here with the grandness of life, but more the kind of tensions within the domestic, which is fascinating. And this is perhaps more for you, Oksana, because obviously unfortunately, Ukraine has kind of become defined by conflict and revolution and war over this last 10 years, particularly. Has that impacted on you as a writer? How does that impact on you as a writer when your country becomes so defined by these huge world events?
Yeah, that's it has been difficult, because in the case of the large invention that happened this February, it actually made it much harder for me to speak, because suddenly everything I say is measured against basically death, and that's a pretty high standard. And whatever you say, you have to remember that somebody's who is reading it might have lived through something horrific, and so on and so forth. So you don't want to be saying things that are unimportant or uninteresting, or I don't know. And it's probably not the right mindset. So this is just what it is. This is definitely not what people should feel or should experience. So and also, when with that much of violence, you can become almost detached from it. You can't live in it all the time, and therefore it's harder to plunge into any kind of writing, for that matter. But then little by little, you do start trying things. And again, it's not anymore for the sake of writing, but you almost forget that writing is a separate process. It just kind of merges with you in a different way. So that has been my experience. I know many people who, on the contrary, had discovered a capacity for a voice. For me, it has been an ongoing struggle, actually.
It's interesting what you say about the domestic, Stefan, because I'm always interested in what people mean when they kind of they point it out, because for me, people live their lives at a domestic scale. That's how we experience the world, is within our homes, within our families, within our very close communities. That's the only way we can really make sense of the world. And even when there are much bigger events taking place, much bigger stories, we're still experiencing them at a very domestic scale. And I mean, for me, it's such a, I'm very conscious of sitting here in Nottingham and being very removed from what's happening in Ukraine. And yet at the same time, much of my experience and my understanding of it is happening through social media, as well as through broadcast media, broadcast journalism. And that's a very domestic scale. I'm following individual people on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm seeing video clips of, individual soldiers, individual fighters, individual people in very specific situations. And it's a very domestic experience, but that's how life happens. And I think that's why writers often work at that scale, fiction writers.
Thank you for that, John. Irena, I think you had a question for John.
Oh, yeah. I have more than one, but I will start from something which really make me curious. What was your first encounter with Ukrainians? Because I suggest that probably you knew some Ukrainian writers, or probably readers, except of Oksana and me, which you just meeting today.
Yeah, I was trying to think about this before this evening, and I'm pretty sure the first Ukrainian writer I met was Andrei Kirkov. Several years ago at a conference, a literary conference in Norwich, and I saw him it was at the university campus in Norwich, and I saw him. It was kind of in the evening, and he was on the field, and I was just started to say hello to him, and he suddenly got very excited about a load of rabbits on the far side of the field, and went chasing after them, and insisted that I join him in chasing these rabbits. I don't know, he wanted them to leave. So the two of us were chasing rabbits across the field at sunset in Norwich. And that's my major encounter with Ukrainian literature, and until more recently.
Just marvelous. Thank you for sharing. And my question to Oksana probably would not be exactly the same, but and a different angle. Oksana, you've left Ukraine for the United States many years ago, actually 22 years ago. And probably at that point, many times in your life, you had been understood as a metonymia of your own country. What was you had to explain to the foreigners, to friends and strangers about your country, and how actually did it change through the 2 decades?
Oh, it's a great question, because when I actually came to the States, which was in the early 2000s, the questions people would ask me, and I landed in Florida, so we all kind of have this mental map of Florida. They asked me, wonderful, so how you're from Ukraine, so how close is your city to St. Petersburg, Russia? And I would be saying, well, you know, it's kind of like from here to Canada, and it's in another country, but other than that, so people would be kind of puzzled, because again, there would be this fusion of Ukraine with Russia and so on and so forth. Whereas nowadays, I think it changed tremendously, even after the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014, because people will think twice before asking me whether I'm Russian. So I think we've come a long way, well, it depends. I guess some people just don't ask. They feel, I know that people sometimes feel almost guilty that it's happening in our country, and that they don't know enough about it, or they are afraid to sound, you know, uninformed, and so on and so forth.
Allow me to jump in right away and ask you, just couple of minutes ago, you stated East Europe is my identity, but I believe Eastern Europe itself is changing, is under great and seismic shift in our own minds. And let's talk together about the changing mental maps, which probably also penetrate into your prose.
Yes, they definitely do change, and I guess it's a little bit of a misnomer, really, like what is Eastern Europe? What are these parts of the world that we used to name? It's kind of like in the United States, every language program used to be part of what they call area studies. So people would attach certain things to certain areas, but then when in my department they have Romanian language, people go like, oh, wait a minute, that's also Eastern Europe? We thought it's just the Slavic world. So yeah, and even the concepts of what is East, what is West. Technically, Ukraine is West because civilizationally we rely on the same basic texts, which is the Bible and the Greek mythology. So, but when I say that, what I mean is that Eastern Europe has been this war theater for so long that, you know, it's almost a cliche to say that our dead don't die. We just have so many of them that they still wander around, which is we haven't buried them. So I guess that's the part that I mean when I say that I carry that with me.
I don't know about you, Irina and Oksana, but I know a lot of Lithuanians kind of bridle at the notion of Eastern Europe, and in fact redefine themselves. So they say they're Central Europe because they're the geographical center of Europe, and would probably prefer Northern European or Baltic as opposed to Eastern European as a way of identifying them. Going back to one of Irina's questions about John's introduction to Ukraine and Ukrainian writing, Oksana, perhaps you could tell us somebody that we should be reading from Ukraine. I mean, I have to say that the only Ukrainian writer that I have read is a guy I've had the pleasure of publishing through Noir Press, which is Yaroslav Melnik, who wrote some wonderful short stories. Was Lviv based, I believe, is now currently living in Lithuania. Oksana, other people that we should be reading from Ukraine?
Well, there's lots of people. It's the whole Ukrainian literature, frankly, and that's if we are talking about it in entirety. We have some contemporary writers translated, and there's plenty of contemporary writers that are just awesome and are to be read. And actually, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute is just publishing a bunch. They just, I think whoever's out is Volodymyr Rafeyenko and Olena Styashkina, who are both from the east of Ukraine. So that might be interesting to the British reader. and more are coming. But we also have so many classics that the world has not read and has not integrated in their mental map of, I don't want to use the word Eastern Europe, but let's just say Europe, because that's European thought, kind of to follow what Irina was asking. And yeah, I want to mention Lesa Ukrainka, who is a Ukrainian playwright and dramatist and poet from the fin de siècle, not this one, but the previous one, whose dramas are, dramas in verse, in poetic dramas are extremely important for European thought, because she draws on pan-European mythology, or again, Bible, or Greek mythology and so on, or history of the Roman Empire, Greeks. And she has not been read enough, and I think some more translations of hers are coming, so she would definitely be the author to discover.
Well, I think we're going to have to get you to send us some of those so that we have those written down as recommendations for our reading list.
With pleasure.
Only fair to ask John, who are we missing out, John? Who should we be reading? Who do you feel is like readers that are not valued enough and we should be reading more of?
From the UK?
From wherever you think appropriate.
Okay, me on the spot. Well, I think, if you to go back to your opening suggestion that I kind of writing about Englishness, or about English British identity, I think the writers such as Sarah Hall and Max Porter are writing really interestingly about rural British, or specifically English identity. Claire Louise Bennett is writing really interestingly, doing something kind of both very new and very kind of traditional with her prose and her style. I don't know. There's a lot of people. I think it's a really exciting time for British publishing. I think the small independent presses are doing really exciting things. Fitzcarraldo and Daunt Books and Influx. And the fact that the Booker shortlist this year had half of the publishers were small independent presses was really exciting.
That's fab. Adding to my reading list now. I think it's a number of people I need to be reading as a consequence of that. I just want to invite our audience to remind them that they have the opportunity for a question. And in fact, I've got one here. So is there something about the Ukrainian language in particular which makes it different from Russian or Polish, or different and important to write in? So that's one of our attendees has asked that. So is there something about the Ukrainian language in particular that's different from Russian or Polish, and different and makes it unique in terms of how you write? Oksana, what do you think about that one?
Linguistically, well, yes, it's different. I always I try to resist offering parallels with other languages and the comparisons, because there will always be somebody in the audience who actually knows those languages better than I do and will tell me that that's not indeed so. If I say like that, it's kind of like Spanish and Italian, there would always be someone Spanish and Italian who would say, no, Spanish people don't understand Italian, or the other way around, and so on. So, but what I mean, they are of the Slavic roots, but that not all vocabulary will coincide, and there will always be plenty of what we call the false friends of translators, where in one language the word will mean fresh bread, and in another language it will mean stale bread, and completely the opposite, and so on and so forth.
Maybe it's important to add that golden standard of Ukrainian language is still in the making.
That's true.
It's drawing more or less on the central dialects, which were based around Kiev and Poltava. And by the way, Taras Shevchenko was one of the big names of this new influx of Ukrainianness at the beginning of 19th century in the Romantic era. But if you think about dialects, you should think of them as still living, which is different from contemporary Russia and contemporary Poland. And another thing is that structurally, Ukrainian language is closest to Slovak language. And with Polish and with Russian, it has many differences. Major difference is probably that Russian has a great difference between how words are pronounced in comparison how they are written. And Ukrainian, because exactly that it has underwent many changes through the 19th century, the pronunciation and the written form is closest. That's why you can actually play with that much more easily and with big creativity.
Well, that's true. And yeah, so people ask sometimes if you can understand other Slavic languages. You can if you were exposed to them. So, but it's not going to be 100% intuitive if you never have.
Thanks. That's really really interesting. It's interesting how these languages interplay with each other. But Oksana, I mean, obviously you speak English fairly fluently. You've worked in America now for well over a decade, yes. Do you still only write creatively in Ukrainian, or do you write creatively? Because I believe that English and Ukrainian, you also speak Russian. You know, you are multilingual. Do you write in any of those other languages?
Not really. I can write academically in English, kind of like if it's an essay, if it's something that's thought-driven. But if it's something that image-driven, no. It's that's where the language has to open, kind of like a flower, I guess. And I'm afraid my English, if I were to try to forcefully open it for searching for images, it would just bring banalities forth and make everybody's head hurt. So I don't venture into it.
Well, that kind of interests me, because obviously John is a great stylist in terms of his writing. And John, kind of wanted to pose to you, because there was something interesting I read that you wrote at some point, where you said that, well, you were talking about Reservoir 13, which you introduced this evening this evening with a reading from, and you said that when you set up that structure, that each of your chapters represented the 13 years. That constricted how you could tell the narrative, that constricted your ability to construct a narrative. And I was wondering if you enjoyed that process of making your job as a writer harder, because that forced more creativity upon yourself, rather than the way that which of the poets was it that said that writing verse without rhyme is like playing tennis without a net. You know, you kind of need the rules, the restrictions in order to make your writing interesting. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm a big believer in that by making it harder, you can make it easier. You know, by kind of setting up lots of constraints and forms, you can. It just helps to get the job done. And which is why I'm fascinated by translation. You know, I think the job of a translator must be really fascinating to kind of have these constant puzzles to solve, and you know, forms to follow, and you know, a kind of clear destination. But with Reservoir 13 in particular, what became really interesting was the kind of the handling of time. So because I'd set up this very definite structure, and the narrative had to keep moving forward in a very constant way. I realized that usually when you tell a story, you slow down at the interesting bits and speed up over the boring bits. And I kind of had stopped myself being able to do that. And so it threw up a whole new, interesting, different way of working. And I've always enjoyed doing that, kind of finding a structure or a technique that is on the surface going to make it harder, but actually ends up generating something interesting and new.
Do you relate to that, Oksana?
Well, that's very interesting. I've always found it fascinating that, you know, kind of when do you go longer, when do you go shorter, when do you compress things, when do you expand on them. So now I will have to think of what John said and to kind of re-examine my own work on what am I doing? Am I just kind of like relishing in the interesting parts and kind of rushing through the what I perceive as not interesting, and it kind of brings forth this whole idea of what we consider interesting and what we don't consider interesting, and how we structure narration, and what do we consider worthy being in the text and not. I actually read John's work. I remember there was several things happening at once, and it's like mundane things, but then there was this clanking of metal containers, like somebody throwing trash there, and it was so vivid. I was almost looking out of the window as somebody throwing trash into my container. So yeah, but I remember that kind of vividness and these several streams of time that were kind of happening at once.
Yeah, and you do seem to relish sound, John, in your writing, which is a beautiful thing and an interesting thing. One of the things that really adds poetry to your language. Talking about that, one of our audience has asked John about your novels have been translated into other languages, and what you felt about that.
I'm constantly ashamed that I don't yet speak any other languages. I'm in the process of learning Dutch at the moment. I was recently in the process of learning Italian. I've kind of jumped ship, but I would love to study a language seriously enough to be able to, not to do the translation, but to at least take an interest in the process of translation. I quite often have conversations with the translators, and the questions they ask are really, really interesting, really useful insights into how the text is working and how different languages operate. You know, there are often questions about gender. Other languages, you know, much more gender in the grammar, and it's really clear from the questions that translators have read the text more closely than anybody else. So translators will always find mistakes that editors have missed. So I love those conversations, but yeah, they always make me feel very kind of English in my lack of other languages.
Translators must be one's deepest readers, I think.
Yeah.
The sense of understanding of a text, and why the choice of words and why the choice of images. Do you find that, Oksana? Obviously, because you're working between different languages, does that bring out more for you, that quick question?
Yeah, I actually, we did a few translations with my co-translator, because we are doing it into English and I'm not bold enough to just do it on my own. But we are doing it with Elena Jennings, who's a New York-based writer. And yeah, it was very interesting. We did a memoir of a Ukrainian writer, Artem Chekh, who was, it's his diary of war, basically. He was, you know, part of the armed forces of Ukraine. And then we did poetry by Katerina Kaletko, one of Ukraine's best poets right now. And I learned way more about Ukrainian texts and English texts than I ever thought I would as a reader, as when I was a translator. Yeah, it's each word had to be thought over for hours.
You guys are both academics, you work at the universities, and you write on a professional basis. So my question would be, what is the proportion of one and another? How do you define you in different periods of your life? And what does it bring to your writing that you actually work with students of creative writings in case of John, and students of Eastern Europe in case of Oksana?
Excuse me, thank you. Sorry. Oksana, do you want to
John,
go first?
do you want to?
Oh, okay. It's, yeah, I still hesitate to think of myself as an academic. You know, I came into, it is 10 years this year that I started at the university, but I came into it as a writer, as a professional writer, rather than as an academic. And I've kind of quite slowly got the hang of working within the university system and working with students and thinking about what writing means. But it's been really valuable for my own writing process, my understanding of my process, and and my editing process. And at its best, it is really, really rewarding to work with young people who are just beginning to find their voice and find their writing and their reading. And yeah, it can be really satisfying to, you can show them quite simple things that help them to make big kind of steps forward in their understanding of their own writing and their own reading. So I really value that. At the same time, I'm kind of half and half academic writer, and I find it very difficult to kind of balance the two things, because they take up very different headspaces. So it can be a struggle. But struggle is too grand a word. It can be awkward.
Oh, I love that. I love that expression, can be awkward. I think I can relate to that difficulty with balance, and kind of, for writing, you need these uninterrupted stretches of time, and it's not enough to just have an hour or two. It has to be the whole day at least, or preferably several days. And I have this neurosis: if I have to go somewhere, and I that's the day that it's lost to writing, pretty much. So, but as for my students, I enjoy working with them, and it's very enriching because of the kind of questions they ask about Eastern Europe or about Ukraine. And I think, Irina, you worked with people from abroad too in Ukraine that come to UKU, so you probably know how that is. And while explaining things to them, you actually learn about your own context so much more. So, and some of them, I'm just friends with some of them that graduated, that finished, especially graduate students. So there's a cherished connections, definitely.
We're running very short of time at this moment in time, which is a shame, because I just feel like the conversation started. There's certainly a lot more questions that I wanted to throw in there that I've not been able to this moment of time. Maybe get another one quicker. There's another one from the audience, from Zoe Fairbairns. Thanks, Zoe, for this question. So I'm going to throw this one in towards our end. So Zoe has enjoyed and admired Ukrainian writer Marina Levitska's book, A Short History of Tracts in Ukrainian and Two Caravans. What's your view on her writing?
I actually don't think I have read that work in full. I know what it is about, and I'm perfectly fine with all kinds of writing coexisting and existing. I know that there was pretty strong reactions in Ukraine about the book, because some people said it doesn't portray Ukrainians in this kind of correct light and so on. But then, I think we should get used to it, because every country that has been very present on literary scene or film scene has that all the time. In America, they just had this movie about a TV series about some woman going to Paris, and then the French were like, no, we're not like she sees us, and so on and so forth. But it happens to people every day. So we're going to get some representations of ourselves that we are not going to like. But I'm rather inclined to see it as a positive thing, because there has to be this diversity. It just doesn't happen that everybody sees us in some kind of idealized way.
That's interesting. Even I'll be interested whether you agreed or disagreed with that. I remember when Jonathan Franzen brought the corrections out, and the Lithuanian response to the idea that they'll be eating horses in the street was of utter horror. Irina, what did you think about that, about Monika Levitska's work?
I also have been thinking, while Oksana has been speaking, about Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated, because it's based in Ukraine. There are all kinds of misconceptions and this deconstruction of stereotypes on the way, and on the top of that, the style of writing is a bit of magical realism, something like that. But it was immediately translated into Ukrainian, and that was the best it could actually happen to the book, because it opened up the discussion, but also opened up this awkwardness, and part of a special delight, I believe, of misunderstanding, which is nice, not necessarily rude.
True, it's like every reading begins with misreading.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the conversation this evening. Thank you very much, Oksana, for joining us from America. Thank you, John, for joining us from Nottingham, and thank you, Irina, for joining us from Lviv this evening. We are going to finish off with some readings, and I believe John is going to give us another short reading now, and then I'll hand over to Irina very quickly to introduce Oksana's final reading.
Okay, so I'm going to read from my most recent novel, which was Lean Full Stand, which was not set in the local countryside. It was set in Antarctica. And this, again, is from fairly early on in the book. So all you need to know is that there are 3 men and they're in trouble. It had taken 5 minutes to walk up from where he'd left the skidoo. The cliffs facing out to the Sound were barely 30 meters above the water, enough to add a little drama to Thomas's pictures. From here, the view of the whole valley was excellent. In the near distance, the red field hut of Station K sheltered in the lee of Garrod Ridge. Below the field hut, the ground sloping down to the skiway, marked by orange fuel drums and black flags, and beyond that, the dark grey waters of Lopez Sound, fringed with fast ice. In the Sound, the icebergs had turned against each other, dipping and rocking with a sudden unexpected movement in the water. Doc had looked up towards Bird Glacier and seen a thick rolling shadow of banked clouds, a faint orange light, a surge of water coming down towards them. It came out of nowhere, and it came in fast, the temperature dropping sharply. He'd seen Thomas glancing over his shoulder and trying to fold away his camera tripod, and when he tried the radio, there'd been no response. He'd seen Luke standing beside the skidoo, turning to look at him. He'd barely managed 2 steps towards the shelter of the slope before the wind slammed hard against him and pushed him back towards the edge of the cliff. He adopted a prone position, slipping quickly across the loose scree, scrabbling for a foothold and finding only thin air behind him. He stretched out his arms and tried to shift his weight forwards. He closed his eyes and concentrated. He arched 1 foot out and around to the left, bringing his knee up towards his chest. The noise of the wind was so violent it was difficult to think. His boot touched rock finally, but when he pushed out against it, the rock loosened and fell away down the sheer drop. For a long, giddy moment, his weight swayed away after it. He slowed his breathing. He concentrated. He inched his way forward again. The cliff wasn't high, but he wouldn't survive a fall. I'll leave you there, on the edge.
Thank you, John. There is a big intrigue to leave us there. Time for me also to pass the floor to Oksana and to ask you to give us your final reading, please.
Yes, I am going to just read a poem. It was translated by Oksana Maximchuk and Max Rosuchensky. It's a poem called The Cat. Father asked, "Write a poem about me, how I was young, how I was, period. Played the guitar, chased a soccer ball in the field, bouncing it with my head high into the sky. How I returned home to our apartment that smelled of oatmeal and Saturday laundry with a tapestry hanging on the wall. On the tapestry, a man and a woman, woven in red, ride a pair of black horses. No, Father, I kept saying, I can't. I don't know how to write about it. It's too close. It's too close, so it doesn't seem real. All right, he sighed and went to work, exchanged his fedora for a baseball hat, his guitar for a church choir, and soccer for a car. Nobody cooked oatmeal anymore, but the tapestry stayed. And then he stopped asking. He realized that I'll never write about him. But we have a cat, he chuckled, write about a cat. A red cat with white spots, a red cat with a white voice. If I don't make it into your writing, let at least the cat remain, woven out of air."
That was beautiful, Oksana. Thank you very much for the final reading. And thank you all. Thank you very much to the audience who has joined us tonight. And a last thank you to John for joining us tonight. Thank you very much for your time here. Thank you very much for Oksana. And I hope you have a nice rest of the day. And Irina and Bogdana, thank you very much. And from Nottingham's UNESCO City of Literature and Lviv's UNESCO City of Literature as well, thank you. And I think we would all wish Irina and Bogdana, particularly in Lviv, that you have a peaceful time and that you get on well, given these very difficult circumstances at this moment in time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
That was beautiful, Oksana. Thank you very much for the final reading. And thank you all. Thank you very much to the audience who has joined us tonight. And a last thank you to John for joining us tonight. Thank you very much for your time here. Thank you very much for Oksana. And I hope you have a nice rest of the day. And Irina and Bogdana, thank you very much. And from Nottingham's UNESCO City of Literature and Lviv's UNESCO City of Literature as well, thank you. And I think we would all wish Irina and Bogdana, particularly in Lviv, that you have a peaceful time and that you get on well, given these very difficult circumstances at this moment in time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Irina.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. That
Thank
was
you.
so interesting.
We gone.
Thank you for the chance and for the platform to have this meet up.
Oh, you're so welcome. I just wanted to switch my camera on and start asking loads of questions. So interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. That was great. Thank you. I
Oh,
wish it
thank you.
was longer.
Time went way too quick. There were so many questions I actually wanted to ask you and didn't get to ask you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have to make these events longer next time.
Yeah, it's a great
Definitely.
crowd.
Oksana, will you send a list of those writers you were recommending?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. Yes.
That would be great.
Yes, please. That'd be
Same for
brilliant.
you.
I can
Okay,
put
yeah.
those on the YouTube video as well. Put some links to them.
That would be
Oh,
fun.
wonderful.
That'd
Wonderful.
be fantastic.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Yeah.
Dear Pippa, once again, thank you for all the preparatory work that you put in. And without that, nothing would happen.
You are very welcome. It's an absolute pleasure. One of the best jobs I've done this year, so I'm really, really, really happy about it.
You are very kind, too kind.
No. Okay,
Great.
brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone.
right.
I'll let you know when the recording's up on YouTube. Hopefully it'll be by next week, but I'm not sure because I've still got the Nanjing one to do, but it'll be up within a week.
Okay.
So that would be great.
Brilliant.
We'll wait for the link. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Stay,
you.
We'll
stay
see
well.
see you
Yeah.
again in 2 weeks, Irina.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm
Great to
Stefan.
meet you all.
Actually. Yes.
Take care.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night
Bye-bye.
to all then. Good night. Cheers.